Welcome and thank you for attending this webinar. Today we will provide an overview of the functionality available in the Recruit and Onboard Scheduling Center module. My name is Nick Zimmer. I am the Recruit Configuration Lead on the Applications and Reporting team. Before we get started this morning, I'd first like to cover a little bit of webinar housekeeping. This is a 2-hour webinar and we do not have any planned breaks. However, we will be pausing regularly throughout the webinar to address questions as a group. Due to popular demand, we will be recording this webinar. You will receive an email from recruitonboard@das.ohio.gov in the near future with a copy of these slides and information to access the recorded webinar video. For those of you who have not attended a GoToWebinar recently, I'll briefly review the webinar features. The image on your left displays your GoToWebinar tool pane. The orange arrow circled in red allows you to expand and collapse the full webinar window, which is illustrated by the image on your right. Use the hand icon at the bottom of your tool pane to raise or lower your hand. You will be using this feature to answer questions throughout the webinar, so stay tuned. Finally, the full webinar window includes a questions section. When you submit your questions, my team will be responding out to the full group, so you will be able to review all answered questions in this section. This is the first of 2 Recruit and Onboard Advanced Functionality webinars. On Thursday, we will provide training on the Cherry Road Public Sector Assessment module, also known as CPSA. Please keep in mind, the functionality addressed in these webinars will only be available to users with specific permissions in the Recruit and Onboard system. We will get into the specifics of these permissions in the next few minutes. You should contact your HR administrator if you do not believe you have the permissions needed to perform your job duties. In today's training, we will define scheduling center permissions and related security, detail the process to create a new calendar and assign calendar permissions, demonstrate how to add and manage calendar time slots, show how users will associate calendars to their requisitions, illustrate the process to invite candidates to self-schedule, and describe how users can manage scheduled candidate appointments. But first, what exactly is the Scheduling Center module? The Scheduling Center is an integrated tool in the Recruit and Onboard application that allows recruiter users to create and manage calendars and time slots for candidate appointments. It also supports self-scheduling functionality for candidates to select available appointments. Access to the Scheduling Center module is determined by your Recruit and Onboard permissions. There are 3 core Recruit and Onboard roles that allow a user to access the Scheduling Center module. Those roles include Recruiter, Recruiter Confidential, and Hiring Manager Interviewer. While these roles give users access to the module, users will only have access to the calendars that have been specifically shared to them. This is where the Scheduling Manager comes in. The Scheduling Manager is a supplemental role that a user would receive in addition to their core role. As well as having access to the Scheduling Center, the Scheduling Manager role gives a user the ability to create new calendars and preliminarily grant calendar permissions to other users. The Scheduling Manager role is a key role for any agency that intends to utilize self-scheduling functionality. DAS recommends agencies limit the number of users with the Scheduling Manager role to 1 user per recruiting department. This is an important consideration because scheduling managers can only view and access calendars they have created. If multiple scheduling managers create calendars within a single recruiting department, duplicate calendars can be created unknowingly. So, as a best practice, 1 scheduling manager in each recruiting department should be responsible for creating all calendars. Once the calendars have been created, the scheduling manager can grant varying levels of permissions to recruiter users, and the same user can have different permissions for different calendars. So here's a glimpse of those calendar-specific permissions. A read-only user can only view information within an assigned calendar. Information available include calendars, calendar roles, and time slots. So the read-only user can access the system, for example, to track candidate attendance to interviews. The next level of calendar permissions is the marked arrive no-show user. This user has all of the permissions of the read-only user, and they can also mark in the calendar if a candidate has arrived to an interview or if he or she did not show up. The next level of user permission is a schedule appointments user. This user has all of the permissions of the read-only and marked arrive no-show user, and they can also manage appointments. What this level of access means is the user can decline an invitation on behalf of a candidate, schedule or reschedule an appointment on behalf of a candidate, or cancel an appointment on behalf of a candidate. The next level of permission is the manage time slots user, which has the permissions of a read-only marked arrive no-show and schedule appointments user. In addition to this, they can also manage time slots, days, and the number of appointments available per time slots. This level of access allows a user to lock and unlock days, delete time slots in a calendar, and set the number of appointments available per time slot. And finally, the Administer Calendar user has all of the permissions for a specific calendar. In addition to the access described in the lesser roles, this level of access allows a user to edit your calendar, manage time slots, manage days, and grant or revoke calendar roles to other users. As a note, an Administer Calendar user cannot create calendars or revoke rights of a calendar owner or of another calendar administrator. So as a note, the 5 permissions you see listed here are permissions that your scheduling managers and other users with the calendar administer role can assign to users once a calendar has been created. All right, at this point, are there any questions? If you do have a question based on the information that I've covered so far, please type that into the questions pane, and we will answer them as quickly as we can. Okay, it looks like we have no questions coming in, so I will now make this your turn to answer a question. So this is a true or false question. You can raise your hand via the webinar tool pane if the following statement is true, or leave your hand down if the statement is false. All right, so here's the statement. True or false, only users with the Scheduling Manager supplemental role have access to the Scheduling Center. I'll read that one more time. True or false, only users with the Scheduling Manager supplemental role have access to the Scheduling Center. All right, I think we had enough time. The correct answer in this case is false. Any user with the recruiter role or the specialized hiring manager interviewer role can access the Scheduling Center. The important difference, however, is that they can only view and or edit specific calendars that have been assigned to them. The scheduling manager has access to the scheduling center, but they also have the ability to create new calendars. It looks like we did just have a question come in. So the question asked is, if the Administer Calendar roles doesn't allow you to create calendars, what role should someone who is doing all roles get? Manage time slots. I'm sorry, could the user who asked this question just maybe rephrase that question for me? Okay, well, if you think of a different way to ask that question, I guess what I can clarify is you're correct that the Administer Calendar role will not allow you to create a calendar. However, the scheduling manager can assign a user, oh, here, I think this question just rolled in. Okay, so the question is, if the Administer Calendar role doesn't allow you to create calendars, what role should the recruiter have that allows you to create and assign roles? Good question. So the scheduling manager role would be used to create calendars. But once that calendar is created, that scheduling manager can assign another recruiter calendar permissions for that specific calendar as an Administer Calendar user. That ability gives that second recruiter user the ability to assign calendar permissions within that one calendar. So for example, a scheduling manager might create 3 calendars and assign that same recruiter as an Administer Calendars user for every single one of those calendars. That second recruiter user then can perform all of the same functionality as the scheduling manager within those 3 assigned calendars. They can grant permissions, they can revoke permissions, they can manage time slots, they can do anything within those 3 calendars. The only thing that recruiter can't do is create a new calendar. And that's where that scheduling manager comes into play. That scheduling manager is an important role to the setup of your scheduling center because they are the only user who can create those calendars. And it looks like we have one more question. Can you have more than one calendar manager? And I'm thinking you're referring to the scheduling manager role. You can have more than one scheduling manager, and I don't think it's a bad idea to have a backup scheduling manager. However, as I stated previously, it's a best practice that you have one active scheduling manager. And the reason that is because scheduling managers can only see the calendars that they create or calendars that they have specifically been assigned permissions to see. So the danger of having 2 scheduling managers within the same department is that they could feasibly be creating the same exact calendars, and if they're not assigning the calendar permissions to each other, they may have no idea that they have those 2 duplicate calendars in existence. And once you start associating those calendars with different requisitions, that could become an even bigger problem, as you can probably imagine. All right, any other questions before we move on from security and permissions? Oh, here's one more question. If I handle all recruitments and all interview scheduling for my entire agency, what role should I have and permission level for all full access? I think the answer to that question is you would need to work with your HR team to determine who that user should be. Specifically, As a recruiter, you can just be assigned a recruiter or recruiter confidential role, and you would have access to all calendars within your department so long as those calendars have been shared with you. So the idea of the scheduling manager is that scheduling manager would create most of your calendars that you'd be using up front within the first few months of the system being live. As long as calendar permissions are shared, all recruiter users will be able to access those calendars and can perform all of the functions that they need to manage time slots, grant or revoke permissions, so on and so forth. All right, let me see. A few more questions rolling in. So the question is, in a small agency with one HR person, I will be the scheduling manager and contact DAS, who will be my Administer Calendars person. No. So the scheduling manager role is essentially an agency's administrator role for the scheduling center. A scheduling manager creates the calendars, and the scheduling manager has the ability to grant permissions to that calendar once it's created. So once you've created your calendar as a scheduling manager, you can assign all of your recruiting staff that Administer Calendars role. What that would do is it would allow you as the scheduling manager and all of your recruiting team as Administer Calendar users access to grant and revoke permissions to calendars. So if you had a new recruiter come onto your team, any one of your recruiters could grant access to that calendar to that new user. All of you would be able to manage time slots, create new time slots, manage candidate appointments. Essentially, once the permissions are shared, recruiters will have as much access, equal access, as you determine based on the permissions you assign. All right, a few more questions coming in. Okay, so the question is, if you are a one-person HR shop, what roles do you need to create and administer calendars? So the answer to that question would be you would at least need one of those three core roles. So I would assume either as a one-person shop, either recruiter or recruiter confidential, and then you would also need that supplemental scheduling manager role. Okay, and one more question. In a large agency with several locations, do we only have one administrator role for calendars? So in the case of an agency with a decentralized recruiting process, if you're working with different recruiting departments that have their own security, I would recommend one scheduling manager per department. And remember, the administer permission, every recruiter can have the administer permission within a calendar. So as a scheduling manager, I might have a staff of 3 recruiters. I can give every single one of those recruiters administer calendar permissions. So all of those users would then be able to grant and revoke permissions within a calendar. They'd be able to manage time slots within a calendar, so on and so forth. But to answer that question specifically, within a large agency, and especially in one with decentralized recruiting processes where you have secured recruiting departments, a best practice would be that that scheduling manager would exist for each of those decentralized recruiting departments. Good questions. All right. I think we can go ahead and move on to the next section of our webinar, which is getting into our candidate selection workflow functionality. An important consideration when you begin preparing for a selection process in the Recruit and Onboard system is what candidate selection workflow you will use. One aspect of this consideration is how you intend to utilize the Scheduling Center functionality in relation to your selection process. As a reminder, A CSW provides the framework to move candidates through the hiring process in order to evaluate and find the best candidates for a job. A CSW includes steps, statuses, and actions a recruiter must go through before hiring a candidate. The state of Ohio has 3 standard CSWs, or candidate selection workflows: the Ohio CSW, the Ohio CSW pipeline, and the Ohio CSW interview only. The default candidate selection workflow when recruiters create requisitions is the Ohio CSW. The CSW selection can be changed in the requisition edit form when creating a new requisition or editing a requisition that has not yet been posted. As an important note, once candidates have applied or been matched to your requisition, you cannot change the CSW. That candidate application has locked that CSW into place for your requisition. So be certain you have selected the appropriate CSW before you post your requisition. Now, the Scheduling Center interacts with the standard CSWs in a few different ways. When creating a requisition, be sure to select the CSW that best suits the selection process for your recruitment. Here's a view of the additional screening and the interview steps within the Ohio CSW and the Ohio CSW pipeline. Within these 2 candidate selection workflows, you'll see in the additional screening step, you can send candidates to the Cherry Road Public Sector Assessment Module, or CPSA, through the CPSA step listed second in place. Below that, you'll see you also have the ability to invite candidates to self-schedule in the additional screening step. Within the interview step, you have the ability to track interview scores for candidates in CPSA that have already been sent over in the additional screening step. And finally, you have the ability to invite candidates to self-schedule in the interview step, but only if they were first invited to self-schedule in the additional screening step. So if you might be able to pick up from how this graphic is displayed, the important aspect of the Ohio CSW and Ohio CSW pipeline, if you use these 2 candidate selection workflows, is that the assumption is you would always start with your testing or your invitations to self-schedule at the additional screening step. And if an interview included access to the Cherry Road Public Sector Assessment Module, or if the interview would involve self-scheduling, the assumption is that you would have already utilized that functionality within the previous additional screening step. So that brings us to the Ohio CSW interview only. With this candidate selection workflow, you can advance candidates through the additional screening step without any testing or self-schedule statuses. So that means when you would get to your interview step, you'll see the first place where you can send candidates to the assessment module is in that interview step. And below that, you'll see that you also then have the ability to invite candidates to self-schedule for the first time in that interview step. The specifics behind why we've created this interview-only CSW we'll be able to get into once I can actually get into the system to show you in a little bit more detail how that comes into play. All right, and at this point then, do we have any questions regarding the candidate selection workflows? I know we haven't completely finished our discussion on those candidate selection workflows, but let us know if you have any questions now. Okay, and it looks like we did have one question come in that was already answered, but I do want to call it out. I think it's a really good question. The question is, we allow test scores to be good for 1 year. So a candidate could be invited to interview without taking a test for a second vacancy within that 1 year period. When it comes to our interview only CSW, we have the ability to schedule candidates in the CPSA module as well. And we'll be showing you how to do that in our training webinar scheduled for Thursday, the 29th. Okay, and it looks like we now have another question in. The pipeline and interview-only CSWs were not described in the original training. Are they described in detail in the new ELM courses? The pipeline CSW is discussed in the ELM training course. The interview-only CSW, however, is not discussed. However, the purpose of the interview-only CSW really only applies to the CPSA assessment module and the scheduling center, which is why we chose to introduce it through this functionality. Okay, and another question just came in. A candidate is self-scheduling before being sent to CPSA and a second time to interview. What are they seeing the first time? That's a good question. So in the instance that you're going to use self-scheduling for both an assessment or a written examination and then an interview, you would just need to create 2 separate calendars. And I'll show you once we get into the system shortly what that would look like within your requisition when you assign 2 calendars to a requisition. But essentially, in that scenario, you would use the Ohio CSW or Ohio CSW pipeline and move candidates to the invite to self-schedule step in that additional screening step. That would trigger the first invitation to your first calendar to be sent to the candidate. They would log into the scheduling manager and complete their appointment scheduling. And then if that candidate advanced on to the interview stage and you move them to the invite to self-schedule status within the interview step, they would receive that second invitation as a follow-up appointment that would allow them to schedule within that second calendar. So that's the idea behind the functionality there. Okay, and it looks like we are slowing down on questions, so we can go ahead and move forward with our system use, where I will show you how you would actually access the scheduling center and then begin the process to create a calendar. And actually, it looks like we just had one more question come in. So the question is, in the Ohio CSW, if we don't elect to invite to self-schedule in the additional screening step, we cannot utilize the invite to self-schedule in the interview step? That's correct. With the Ohio CSW, if you don't utilize the invite to self-schedule in additional screening, then you can only assign a calendar at one point in the process. The Ohio CSW assumes that that invitation should only be going to the first invite to self-schedule status within that candidate selection workflow. So it's only going to associate that invitation with the invite to self-schedule in the additional screening step. So if you are going to have a recruitment process where you do not intend to use self-scheduling for your examination, then you would want to use this Ohio CSW interview only, because it will allow you to pass the additional screening testing triggers to the CPSA module and to the scheduling center module, and begin those triggers at the interview process. All right. Good questions. At this point then, we can go ahead and I'll close out of this presentation and we can get into the system to create our first calendar. So you'll see at this point, I've logged in as a scheduling manager user. So I'm at my welcome dashboard within the recruiting center. So users with permission to the scheduling center will know they have access immediately because the scheduling center will appear beneath the quick access bar of the welcome dashboard. You can access the scheduling center by selecting this link or by navigating to the recruiting center and from the recruiting center, the scheduling center will also be available from that home menu dropdown. So I've just navigated to the scheduling center. This will bring us to our calendar dashboard, where we'll be able to see all calendars that we have access to. So as a scheduling manager, I have access to calendars that I have created or calendars that have been assigned to me. With this user has already previously created one calendar, which they see below. If they needed access to other calendars that were created by another scheduling manager, that scheduling manager or a user with Administer Calendar's permission would need to share that calendar with me and grant me some level of calendar permissions to be able to see that calendar in my dashboard. So in the case of creating a new calendar, we would select the Create Calendar icon. In this case, I'm actually going to modify an existing calendar so that I can show you what the content of a completed calendar would look like without having to do it. All right, so within the Modify Calendar link, we're brought to our Update Calendar form. This looks very similar to creating a calendar. There's only one difference, which I'll call out near the top of the pane. The Create and Update Calendar form is divided into three parts: calendar properties, calendar location details, and additional locales. So I'll move through every piece of this form and discuss all the different fields and how they interact with your calendar. Oops. All right. The calendar name is the calendar title that will appear internally to users with permissions to the calendar in the scheduling center. So this is something that I can easily identify. It is related to my business transformation analyst. The active calendar field will only become available once a calendar has been created. When you're creating a calendar for the first time, the creation will default as active. So if you wanted to make the calendar inactive, you would just need to modify the calendar by accessing it the same way I previously did, and then uncheck this box. When you save, that will inactivate the calendar. The candidate self-service level field will default to a value of full. This default value of full must remain selected. The other two service levels are not supported in the state of Ohio's configuration of the scheduling center. So if selected, the self-scheduling functionality will not work. All right, so this brings us then to some of the more exciting functionality of the calendar within this new scheduling center module. The Allow Same-Day Scheduling checkbox will trigger as unchecked. If you leave this box unchecked, the appointment will lock to prevent any day of scheduling. In this case, we'll leave it checked. The scheduling cushion field is a contingent field that you'll see only appears if you check to allow the same-day scheduling. It disappears if I deselect that field. The selected value represents the amount of time prior to an appointment that a candidate can self-schedule. So in this case, the selected value is 120 minutes, which would prevent a candidate from being able to select an appointment that is scheduled to begin in less than 2 hours. The scheduling horizon represents how long in advance the candidate may book an appointment on a calendar. The default value is listed here, 14 days. However, the scheduling horizon can be set from 3 to 30 days, and beyond 30, we can select 60, 90, or 180 days. So an example of how this functionality would come into play. Imagine we created a candidate appointment on this calendar every day from Tuesday, from today's date until the end of June. With a scheduling horizon of 14 days, a candidate invited to self-schedule would only be able to see and select the Tuesday appointments that are available within the next 14 days. Okay, this then brings us to the appointment change lockdown field. This field determines for a calendar how close to the time of a confirmed appointment a candidate is allowed to reschedule. If the candidate accesses the scheduling center during the appointment lockdown period, the reschedule message, which will be defined later, will be displayed and the candidate will not be allowed to reschedule. Let's assume a candidate has scheduled an appointment on this calendar for noon today. With this configuration, in about 20 minutes after 10 a.m. today, the candidate would not be permitted to reschedule his appointment to a later date or time. They'd be locked into their scheduled appointment time. And that brings us to the reschedule limit field. This value represents the number of times a candidate is permitted to reschedule. Once the reschedule limit is reached, the reschedule limit reached message, which will be defined later as well, will be displayed, and the candidate will not be permitted to reschedule. All right, and the last field in our calendar properties form is the calendar owner. The calendar owner represents the person responsible for maintaining the calendar. This user does not necessarily need to be the creator. In the case that a user other than the creator of the calendar is selected, so in this case, if I selected someone other than scheduling manager, when this calendar was created, both the creator and the calendar owner would be assigned administer calendar permissions for this specific calendar. So I want to show the user selector field. In order to select a user, we can use the first and last name fields. Click search, and all available users will be returned. Now this user selector field is something really important I want to share. Keep in mind, scheduling managers must grant calendar permissions to allow another user to access the calendar. It's also important to understand that any user selector in the Scheduling Center module will display global Scheduling Center data. So what this means specifically is that all recruiters and scheduling managers in our Recruit and Onboard system will appear in the Scheduling Center selector. So please ensure you're selecting the correct user in your recruiting department before you grant calendar permissions or assign them as a calendar or time slot owner. This email address field will help you to determine whether or not you're selecting the correct user. All right, so we just covered a lot in just this first form. Let's check to see if we have any questions. Okay, no questions. We'll keep them coming in. My team is answering questions in the background, but again, we'll be stopping regularly throughout to address any questions that need to be discussed as a group. All right, so this brings us to the next section of our Create Calendar or Update Calendar form, the calendar location details. The first field listed here is calendar type, which cannot be changed once a calendar is saved. This field allows the user to define whether the calendar can have multiple locations or a single location. Today we're working with a calendar that contains a single location. Agencies who are interested in using multiple locations for a single calendar will need to work with HRD because the locations actually need to be configured by an HRD administrator in the scheduling center. As a note, for those users who might be interested in using the multiple location type, a maximum of 5 locations can exist on a single calendar. The calendar location name represents the location that will be displayed to candidates when scheduling for an appointment. This is an important thing to remember because we'll actually be getting to a display name field later, but the calendar location name is actually what will be displayed to the candidates. So it's something that should be descriptive enough so that they would understand essentially where the calendar is located or the appointment is located. The time zone field should always be set to America, New York, assuming that we're all going to be conducting our appointments within Ohio. And the address fields are all required. These will be fields that display to the candidates once they have scheduled appointments, and they will also receive a reminder the day before that appointment, which will also include these address details. Okay, and that brings us, to our final section of the Update Calendar form, additional locales. So this is where we first get to our display name fields. The calendar display name field represents the calendar name that will be displayed to candidates. It is also the calendar name that is used when a recruiter associates a calendar to a requisition. So this value should be specific in identifying your department, classification, and or type of assessment. The location display name is the name of the location that will appear internally to users with permissions to the calendar in the scheduling center. So keep in mind, we previously discussed the calendar location name. That former field is what displays to candidates when scheduling for an appointment. I don't quite understand why the system was configured that way, but that's definitely an important thing to keep in mind. I have included a calendar display fields page within the slide deck for you to reference. The fields that display to candidates are the calendar display name and the calendar location name. And the fields that display to scheduling center users are the calendar name and the location display name. Definitely reference this as a quick reference guide when you first use the system, just to prevent any confusion with your candidates or with your recruiting team. Okay. So this brings us to the section of the form with our rich text editors. I'll go through each of these fields, explain what their purpose is, and recommend some basic information to be included in each form. The pre-schedule information field will be displayed before the candidate begins scheduling an appointment, as soon as they access the scheduling center. So, for example, if you set a reschedule limit or an appointment change lockdown, that would be relevant information to display to the candidate before they schedule. So in the example I have listed here, I addressed all of the time-based calendar configurations that I set above. The interview directions field will display in the scheduling center once a candidate has scheduled for an appointment. This information will also be shared in the confirmation and appointment reminder emails auto-generated from the scheduling center. Although the field name refers to interview, this field should be used for any type of assessment appointment. Candidates will not see this field name. You would enter interview instructions to provide candidates with details about the appointment itself once they've scheduled. The instructions will also be displayed to candidates in that confirmation and appointment reminder email, which is auto-generated from the scheduling center. Type of assessment, length of time, materials used are some possible values to include in this field. Similarly to the directions field, the field should be used for any type of assessment appointment. Candidates will not see the field name refers to interviews. The reschedule message is a contingent field that will only display if an appointment change lockdown value is selected. You'll recall back up in our first section of the form, we enabled an appointment change lockdown of 2 hours. If the candidate accesses the scheduling center during the appointment lockdown period, the reschedule message will display and the candidate will not be allowed to reschedule. So this is the message they would see in place of being able to schedule. And finally, the reschedule limit reached message is another contingent field that refers to a selected reschedule limit value. Once the reschedule limit is reached, the limit reached message will display and the candidate will not be allowed to reschedule again. So at this point, once we've completed all of the fields that we need within our calendar, we would click Save to create the calendar. In this case, we're just updating it. And as a newly created calendar, it would now display in your calendar dashboard. All right, so it looks like we have a few questions. All right, the question is, how would I end the candidate's ability to self-schedule 2 days before the first test date? Let's take a look back at our lockdown period. I don't believe we have the ability to say 48 hours, but let's double check. Oh, oops. Look at there. We do have 48 hours. So we can set in that instance that 48-hour appointment change lockdown. All right, looks like we have a few more questions. All right, a very good question. Is the calendar only used for self-scheduling? The short answer is yes. It should only be used for self-scheduling. There is functionality that will allow us to schedule on behalf of candidates. However, it's very complex and it's contingent based on whether or not a candidate has already accessed the scheduling center module. If they haven't accessed the module, you will not be able to self-schedule on their behalf. So as a best practice, we recommend utilizing this functionality as a full self-service module for candidates to schedule their own appointments. If you are interested in scheduling beyond any self-scheduling, but just rather tracking candidate scheduled appointments, we'll be showing you in Thursday's webinar how Cherry Road Public Sector Assessment Module will allow you to track scheduled candidate appointments without having them self-schedule for them. All right, a few more questions coming in. Okay, the question is, if I limit the reschedule to one time, however, we wish to grant them the opportunities to reschedule a second time, how would this work? In this case, you would actually need to navigate to the user if they were unable to reschedule within the calendar view and manually prompt them to be rescheduled. So this will clear up their calendar and allow them to reschedule on their own. I'll actually show you what that would look like once we get into our candidate appointment scheduling. Okay, a few more questions coming in. Does the appointment change lock also prevent someone from scheduling for the first time, not just changing an existing appointment? That is a good question, and I think we will have to get back to you on that. We'll do some validation, and we'll send that response out with our webinar information later this week or next week. All right, and another question, is this just for interviews or also used for that CPSA scheduling? Self-scheduling can be done with either a written examination or an interview. In this case, my example here is a written test. Really, the purpose of the scheduling center is to allow candidates the ability to self-schedule. Cherry Road, it would be used to schedule on behalf of candidates. So Cherry Road does not support self-scheduling functionality. So that would kind of be your distinction between whether or not you're using to track your scheduling, whether you're using the scheduling center or CPSA. And then another question came in, is this accessible for JAWS users? We will validate that. Taleo Recruit, which is the system that powers the scheduling center, is ADA compliant. However, I will make sure I validate that within the user documentation as well. All right. It looks like we don't have any more questions rolling in. Oh, one more actually. The question is, does this prevent candidates from self-scheduling if they have reached the one-year disqualification? That's a good question as well. The self-scheduling, or rather the limitation to scheduling, if there is some type of test retake period that has not yet expired, is something handled within the Cherry Road system. So with these systems integrating, we'll show you what that would look like on Thursday. The candidate would be able to schedule within this system. However, we would have a way of preventing them from being invited to actually complete the test within Cherry Road, or rather we would have some type of flag in Cherry Road that would indicate they should not take the test because of that retake period, and we could then disqualify the candidate. All right. So we've answered a few questions from you, and now it's your turn to answer a question. This is another true-false question. Same rules apply. Raise your hand via the webinar tool pane if the statement is true, or leave your hand down if the statement is false. Let me make sure I've cleared our hands. All right. Here's the true or false statement. True or false, the calendar location name field represents the calendar name value that will display to candidates when scheduling for an appointment. Let me restate that because that was really rough. I guess I can't read today. True or false, the calendar location name field represents the calendar name value that will display to candidates when scheduling for an appointment. I'll give you a few seconds to respond. All right. The correct answer is true. Recall the calendar location name, not the location display name, is what candidates will see when scheduling an appointment via the scheduling center. That's really hard to remember, which is why when you're creating these calendars, you should definitely reference this calendar display field slide to make sure you're putting the appropriate information where it belongs. Good job for those of you guys who aced it. All right, so at this point, we can close out of our calendar. We have a calendar created. Our next step, though, I'm not managing this calendar on my own. I want to share my permissions to other users so that we can manage this calendar and manage time slots together. So once we've created our calendar, we can access the permissions pane from within our calendar dashboard by clicking Modify on that specific calendar. From here, we can make any of the updates that we originally made when we originally created or previously modified the calendar. And you'll also see two buttons now at the top of the screen, the Add or Modify Calendar Permissions and the View Audit History. So we'll select Add Modify Calendar Permissions to assign, update, or remove calendar permissions to this specific calendar. All right. So from the calendar permission page, users can review the permissions audit trail through View Audit History, create a new permission, or remove existing calendar permissions. To create a new calendar permission, we would use our user selector by clicking Select User. Use the first and last name fields to limit our search results, and reference the email address field to make sure we're selecting the appropriate user. As a reminder, similarly to the calendar owner selector, this user selector also displays that global data. Once you've selected a user, you can set the intended level of permissions for the specific calendar. Refer back to that Scheduling Center calendar permission slide for specific details about each permission level. Once you've selected your permissions, click Create Permission to confirm your selections and grant the user access to the calendar. The calendar will now appear in the user Scheduling Center calendar dashboard. To modify an existing permission for a user, select the user's assigned calendar permission role in the table. A drop-down bar will appear with the 5 available calendar permissions. Select the new desired permission from the list and click OK to confirm your selection. And to delete an existing calendar permission, just click the red X next to the user's name. A prompt will open confirming you want to remove the calendar permission. Just select OK to confirm that deletion. All right, we rolled through that pretty quickly. Let's see if we have any questions coming in. All right, no questions. So let's go ahead then and navigate back to our calendar dashboard. Oops, that was the wrong button. Here we are back at our calendar dashboard. So for users who have the managed time slots or administer calendar permissions for an existing calendar, they will also be able to add time slots for candidates to schedule appointments. To do that, we would select the desired calendar from our Scheduling Center dashboard. And this will bring us to our calendar page. To add a new time slot, we'll just click the corresponding button at the top of the calendar page. All right, so within our Add Time Slot page, you'll notice the first field is the time slot owner. This is an important field because this user will be notified anytime a candidate schedules an appointment for the assigned time slot. If no owner is selected, the calendar owner will receive the emails as the default time slot owner. So in this case, we'll go ahead and identify our calendar owner as the time slot owner specifically. We then would select the desired start date and end date of the time slots. If you intend to create a single time slot, these dates should be the same exact value. In this case, we'll schedule for a full week from April 2nd to April 6th, our go live date. We would then select the day start time and day end time to identify when the first and last time slot will be created for each day between the start date and the end date. In this case, we'll select 8:30 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. The interval refers to the number of appointments to be created between the selected day start time and day end time. For example, I just set that day start time to 8:30 and the day end time to 9:30. An interval of 1 hour would create a single time slot for that day. Now let's say that I set the day start time to 8 a.m. and I set the day end time to noon. With an interval of 1 hour, I would have 4 time slots created for each day. So again, if you intend to create a single time slot, your interval value should be the exact length of time between your day start and your day end time. In this case, we just want to create 1 appointment per day, so we'll change ours to 8:30 to 9:30 and set our interval to a single hour. We would then enter a numeric value under the Schedule up to a maximum header to determine how many candidates are permitted to schedule for a given time slot. In this case, if we were creating time slots for an interview, we would want to leave this at 1 person, unless we were doing a group interview, of course. In this case, since we're scheduling for our written test, we'll set our maximum up to 20 appointments within that time slot. Then finally, under the On These Days header, we would mark a checkbox next to the days of the week our time slot should be created within the given start date and end date. As a default, Monday through Friday will be checked. If you intend to create time slots on a single day, leaving these other days of the week checked will not impact your time slot creation. So for example, if I selected a start and end date of the 2nd, which would be a Monday, even if all 5 of these were selected, my time slot would still only be created on Monday. Now, if I deselected Monday with this setting, no time slots would be created. And it looks like we just had a question come in. There is no way to schedule a break within this appointment time. So when you're adding time slots, if you want to include a lunch, I would recommend just creating 2 separate time slots, one prior to lunch and one after lunch. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have selected here. I'll change my end date back to the 6th. So as my time slots are configured here, I can expect 3 time slots will be created on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday between April 2nd and April 6th. Each time slot will start at 8:30 a.m. and up to 60 candidates will be able to schedule appointments between the 3 time slots. So in this case, we've completed all fields we need to create our time slots. So we'll click Add Time Slot to confirm our selections. And they'll now exist on our calendar page. Now we can't see these time slots, but if we navigate beyond to April of 2018, we'll now see our time slots have been created. I forgot to do Select Tuesday and Thursday. Well, now we have time slots created on every single day of the week. More testing. So back to our calendar view. Existing time slots you'll see appear with this dark gray date in the sidebar calendar. If you select a date, we'll be able to see the time slots that were created for that day. You can refer to the calendar key at the bottom of the sidebar to identify the purpose of a specific marking in the sidebar calendar. All right, let's check really quickly to see if there are any new questions. All right, first question. If testing on a Monday and a Tuesday, however, the interview start time for Monday is 9 a.m. and Tuesday starting at 10 a.m., how can you modify the different start times? So here you have 2 options. In that case, you can create the same time slots for Monday and Tuesday and have both start at 9 a.m. And then once you've created the time slots, just delete the Tuesday 9 a.m. time slot so that your Tuesday appointments start at 10. Another question, can you schedule a 1-hour time slot from 8:30 to 10 and the candidate is forced to schedule 8:30 start time, thus leaving 1/2 hour break? Well, so the thing to keep in mind with the interval is that it doesn't actually create breaks for you. When you create your time slots, the break would be factored in by creating a longer interval. So for example, you may have a 1-hour interview, but if you wanted 30 minutes after that interview to give yourself a break, then you would just plan your appointments to be based on your begin time and your end time and set your interval to 1 hour and 30 minutes, assuming that that 30 minutes will be your break time in between those interviews to score or, you know, rest your hand. Another question, can you lock down or delete time slots for a lunch break instead of creating 2 separate time slots? That's also possible. You can lock the time slot, you can delete it. It's just kind of your preference. All right. Looks like we don't have any more questions rolling in. So now that we have our time slots created, users with the Manage Time Slots or Administer Calendar permissions can take specific actions on the existing time slots in a given day by using the Time Slot Actions dropdown, which is listed here. So to give you an idea of what each of these actions will do, you can refer to slide 15 in the slide deck. to see exactly what a description of the time slot action would take. In the case of deleting, that selected time slot would be removed from the calendar, and candidates can no longer book the appointments. Let me expand this. If you lock a time slot, a small padlock will display next to that time slot to indicate it has been locked. Candidates will no longer be able to book appointments for that time slot. However, any appointments that have been previously scheduled for that time slot will remain. The unlock action will simply unlock that previously padlocked time slot. The select owner action will allow you to change the time slot owner. So in the case that you did not select a time slot owner and the calendar owner was identified as the default time slot owner, you could use this action to identify another owner for those specific time slots. Remove owner is then the opposite of that, which would default the calendar owner as the user who's notified when candidates schedule. Update appointments is an action that will allow users to modify the number of appointments permitted to be scheduled within the time slot. So for example, if we in our time slots, we had identified 20 appointments can be scheduled within a given time slot. If I did some testing and realized that 5 of the computers in my computer lab weren't working, I could change that appointment to 15 appointments per time slot. Delete all time slots will allow all time slots within that day to be removed, and lock day would lock all time slots within that given day, so that candidates are no longer able to book appointments. However, existing appointments will remain scheduled. All right, and we have another question for you now. This is another true-false question. You can raise your hand via the webinar tool pane if the statement is true, or leave your hand down if the statement is false. Let me put our hands down, and here's the statement. True or false? If a time slot owner is not identified when adding a new time slot, the calendar owner will receive confirmation emails when candidates schedule for that time slot by default. All right, lots of hands going up. That is true. Have I drilled it into your heads enough? Remember, the confirmation emails will always be sent when a candidate schedules an appointment. So if a time slot owner is not identified, the system will default these notifications to that calendar owner. All right, good job, everyone. So at this point, we've created our calendar, or in this case, modified, and we've also now added time slots. So our next step would then actually be associating a scheduling calendar to our requisition. Now keep in mind, we can add new time slots to this calendar at any time, even while the calendar is associated to your requisition. However, it's important to remember that before you invite candidates to self-schedule, you should make sure you have time slots available for them to schedule appointments. So to navigate back to our requisition, we would navigate to the home page. And it looks like I timed out. And actually, this takes us to the welcome dashboard, which is our home page. So we would navigate to our requisition, again, by accessing that Recruiting Center module. And we can go ahead and navigate to our requisitions. So I will actually go ahead and create a new requisition so we can see what it would look like when we're first associating a scheduling center calendar to our requisitions. All right, we're now in the new requisition form. As soon as an active calendar has been created in the scheduling center, it will be available to be associated with your requisitions. As an important note, a calendar can only be associated with a requisition before the requisition is posted. If the requisition is posted before the calendar is associated, you will actually need to unpost your requisition and then set the requisition to on hold before you're able to associate a calendar. New time slots can be created for a calendar at any time, as I mentioned previously. This functionality is not impacted by posting a requisition. However, your calendars must be associated before you post. So in this case, we have a new requisition. This could also be our requisition form while we're still in our draft status. To associate a scheduling center calendar, we'll navigate to section 7 of our requisition file. And here we'll see the Taleo Scheduling Center icon. This is where we'll allow our integration between the Recruiting Center and the Scheduling Center to exist for our requisition. Oh, and it looks like we actually have some questions coming in. There's a question to reiterate the statement about when to associate your calendar. So, a calendar can only be associated with a requisition before that requisition is posted. So before you actually post your job, you have to have already completed this step. The reason you need to do this is because once the requisition has been posted, you won't be able to apply a new calendar to your requisition. In the case that this happens, you actually would need to unpost your requisition and then set your requisition status to on hold. This would then allow you to add a scheduling center calendar. However, you're going through a process of having to unpost your job and change your requisition status. So as a best practice, you should be adding your calendar prior to actually posting the requisition and allowing candidates to apply. The assumption here is that the system wants a calendar selected so that we can show before any candidates have applied, we've determined our assessment process and it is in place. There was also a question, where can I get a copy of these slides? We will be sending these slides out after the completion of this webinar, either later this week or early next week. Okay, we've received another question. Can you unpost and place on hold to attach the calendar in the event that you have a job submission on the requisition? Yes. That is something you can do. You can unpost and place the requisition on hold in order to attach your calendar. It's definitely not a best practice, but it's something that can be done if you inadvertently forgot to associate that calendar. All right. All right, so in order to associate our calendar, we'll first want to check the Taleo Scheduling Center box. This will enable our calendar ID fields. The calendar ID field determines which step or status in the candidate selection workflow will trigger an invitation for candidates to self-schedule to the assessment. Let me repeat that one more time. The candidate ID field determines which step or status in the candidate selection workflow will trigger an invitation for candidates to self-schedule. A calendar cannot be selected for calendar ID 2 unless the calendar has already been selected for calendar ID 1. So here's what that means in a little bit more detail. And here's where our unique candidate selection workflows come a little bit more into play here. Within our Ohio CSW and our Ohio CSW pipeline, the invitation to self-schedule is in the additional screening step first. This invite to self-schedule status is associated with the calendar ID 1 field within your requisitions. The invite to self-schedule status in the interview step of these CSWs is what's associated with the calendar ID 2 on your requisition. So if we look at our Ohio CSW interview only, because we don't have the trigger to invite to self-schedule within our additional screening step, the invite to self-schedule status in this workflow within the interview step is associated with calendar ID 1. So that's why it's important, if you intend to use a selection process where you wouldn't utilize self-scheduling for a written assessment, but you do intend to use it for your interview, the Ohio CSW interview only would be the CSW to select, because you could identify your calendar ID in calendar ID 1, and that invitation would carry over. In the previous example, if you had selected the Ohio CSW and you identified a calendar that you wanted candidates to schedule for in the interview, moving them to the invite to self-schedule status within the interview step wouldn't trigger anything, because that calendar ID 1 is only associated with the additional screening status. So the assumption is that you would need 2 calendars in order to invite the candidate to self-schedule at 2 different points in your selection process. All right, and I know that's getting into some configuration questions, so let's see if we have any questions. Okay, the question we have, will it mess anything up for applicants if the posting is put on hold and a calendar is added? If the posting is put on hold, before a posting can be put on hold, the requisition has to be unposted. So the assumption is that if we're unposting our requisitions, then candidates who might have previously seen that requisition and might previously, identified it in their job cart would no longer be able to apply for it until you had made those changes and reposted it. There is also a question, can the time slot notifications be turned off? At this time, the time slot notifications will be turned on, so that time slot owner will receive them. If this becomes something that users are not interested in, we can look into our options for turning that notification off. Okay, so we have another question. To clarify, we may have an exam plan with a written assessment and an interview step in which some candidates may need to self-schedule for both, and other candidates have already have a passing score for the assessment and would only need to be invited to self-schedule for the interview. How does that work with the CSWs? In this case, if you're using self-scheduling for both steps, you would still utilize that Ohio CSW or the Ohio CSW pipeline. What we'll get into within our Thursday webinar is how once those candidates have scheduled in our Taleo Recruit system, the schedules will then be overwritten based on their previous scores and their previous testing dates in the CPSA assessment module. So your practice would be to invite those candidates to self-schedule and disposition them within Taleo Recruit then immediately so that you know that the candidate doesn't need to retest, and then CPSA will allow you to import their previous test score and test date. All right, another question. Oh, and a follow-up question to the last one. So candidates are still getting the notice to self-schedule even though they don't need to? No, in this case, you wouldn't actually even move those candidates to the self-schedule invitation. It's only at the requisition level that the assumption is there has to be 2 invitations to self-schedule. The limitation isn't the candidates, it's the actual candidate ID field. So in that case, you would move the candidates who need to take the first test to invite to self-schedule, and you would make those candidates who already have an existing score skip that step entirely and move on to the next step in your process. Once those candidates navigate to the second step in the interview process, they'll be able to receive their invitations. All right, a few more questions here. Are the calendars identified as calendar ID 1 or ID 2 based on the step or pipeline, or do we name it? So the calendar ID 1 and ID 2 fields are something that only you as recruiters would see. All you need to know is that calendar ID 1 is going to be associated with the first invite to self-schedule status within your candidate selection workflow. And calendar ID 2 will always be associated with the second invite to self-schedule status within your candidate selection workflow. So where that's important is within your standard Ohio CSW or Ohio CSW pipeline, you can have 2 self-scheduling calendars. Within the Ohio CSW interview only, you can only have 1. All right. So let's navigate back to our requisition. We've now activated our Taleo Scheduling Center integration by checking this box. So we can identify the calendar that we want to select or associate with this requisition by using an item selector for our calendar ID 1 field. We'll select that item selector, and within our code and description quick filters, we can type in the name of our assessment so that we can easily identify it. And once we've identified the calendar we want to associate with our requisition, we'll just click Select, and that calendar will now be associated with our requisition and displayed in the calendar ID field. In this case, we would save our requisition. To make things a little faster, I've already created a requisition and associated it with our calendar, so that we can skip forward to the point where we would actually invite candidates to self-schedule. So, assuming that we've completed all of the previous steps, we've posted our requisitions, we would then have screened candidates so we know they passed the minimum qualifications and they're at the first point in our selection process where we would invite them to self-schedule. Then what we would do is just simply navigate to our candidate list within that requisition. And today we'll be inviting Marsha Mallow to self-schedule. So we'll see her in the MQ screening step with a status of MQs passed. So we will change her step and status to additional screening. And if we were using CPSA, we would first move her to CPSA. In this case, we're just using our invite to self-schedule, scheduling center functionality. So we'll change the status to invite to self-schedule and click Save and Close. Now if we close out of our MQ screening step, we can navigate to additional screening. And with an invite to self-schedule, we'll see we already have some candidates in the step, which includes Marsha. So at this point, Marsha should have received her invitation to self-schedule. We can confirm that that invitation was sent out by reviewing the candidate's history. To do this, we can select the candidate. And navigate to the History tab if you're not already there. And then we would modify our history events to include correspondence. And now we'll see that the invitation to self-schedule for our business transformation analyst was sent with a date timestamp and an event category of correspondence sent. So we can go ahead and select this link to actually view the details of what was sent to this candidate. When you trigger an invitation to self-schedule, this is the default message that will be included when any candidate is invited. So they will see that we are interested in moving forward to the next step, which is scheduling for an in-person assessment, and it will direct them to the scheduling center through a link here. When they click this link, this is where they will access the scheduling center and all of the information that we included in the calendar, including pre-schedule information, interview instructions, interview directions, will all be listed here in a way that will apply to your specific calendars. So I will quickly sign in as Marsha. And demonstrate what a candidate sees when they self-schedule for an appointment. So when the candidate first accesses the scheduling center, as you'll see, they'll be directed to the Open Invitations tab. Note the scheduling instructions beneath the Open Invitations Please Schedule header. These are standard system instructions that will appear anytime a candidate is invited to schedule for a new appointment. Below that, you'll see the calendar location name that was identified when we created or modified our calendar, and also the requisition title below that. And further down, we'll then see our pre-schedule information. This is the information that we entered when modifying the calendar. So in this case, a candidate can continue in their scheduling process by selecting Schedule Appointment. This will direct the candidate to a calendar widget, which looks very similar to our calendar widget within the calendar page. And they can then select an available appointment. We'll select our scheduled time. Once the candidate has selected a scheduled time, they'll be redirected to the Scheduled Appointments tab, which displays all of their confirmed appointments. Appointments and invitations that have expired will be moved to the Closed Invitations tab. The Scheduled Appointments tab displays more specific details about the scheduling appointment. It includes the calendar display name and the street address information. Beneath this, the Directions header contains the information we input into the Interview Directions field within the calendar form, and the Preparation header includes the interview instructions data that we previously entered. All right, at this point, let me see if we have any questions. Is there a way to modify that automatic notice to include the end date for self-scheduling? The automated notice, is this the actual invitation to self-schedule from the recruiting center that you're referring to, or the open invitation instructions? Oh, the former. The former notification can be modified. At this time, we're leaving it as a default. If you identify issues with that information, then it's something that we can look into once we're stabilized. Another question, currently we're able to see that the notification response date, will we be able to see that the notification was successfully sent? If you review the candidate correspondence sent message, you'll see that it includes an email from the candidate account. So you can assume, as long as this email address is accurate, that the invitation was successfully sent, because this correspondence sent email is displayed within your candidate's history. If the candidate's email is still not valid, they still actually will have the ability to access the invitation within their My Job page portal within the career section. All right. And I think my team is handling the rest of these questions, so we can go ahead and move on to the next step in our process, which is managing our scheduled appointments. So once candidates have scheduled for an appointment, users can take certain candidate actions based on their assigned calendar permissions. So to do that, we can navigate back to our scheduling center and view our scheduled appointments by identifying the calendar page. So common candidate actions can be taken on a single candidate by using the icons immediately below the candidate's name in the time slot. I've included a cheat sheet with what those common actions are. The checkbox, let me expand this quickly. The checkbox represents marking the candidate as arrived. The red circle with a cross identifies the candidate would be marked as no-show. The refresh arrows you're seeing would clear that arrival status. So if you inadvertently selected either of these, you could select the clear arrival status to remove either arrive or no-show. And the red X would be the ability to cancel the appointment. However, I'll be discussing what that action specifically means in a little bit more detail shortly. Oops. But first, I want to navigate back to the system so we can see the remainder of our candidate actions. The cancel and reschedule actions listed here and here have the same immediate result, and that is, when used, a candidate's currently scheduled appointment will become unscheduled. The important distinction between the two actions is that a canceled appointment prevents the candidate from rescheduling again. Selecting to reschedule a candidate does not complete the rescheduling process. It simply removes the candidate's currently scheduled appointment time. So there was a question earlier, if we set a reschedule limit and that candidate does want to reschedule and it will be permitted, what would we do? In this case, you would just identify that the candidate should be rescheduled. This will give them an opportunity to reschedule one more time. Canceling a candidate's appointment prevents the candidate from being able to reschedule in that calendar. And once the candidate appointment is canceled, the action cannot be undone. So, for this reason, it's a best practice to reschedule candidates who call to cancel an appointment rather than systematically cancel that appointment. So your action should normally be to reschedule that appointment, which will then give you more flexibility and give your candidates more flexibility in the system. And again, if you intend to schedule on behalf of all candidates for a candidate assessment, we'll be showing you how this would be best supported by CPSA in the upcoming webinar on Thursday, March 29th. However, the functionality does exist to schedule on behalf of candidates in the system. This is a full self-service scheduling center, though, so we will not be demonstrating that functionality today. We encourage you to enable candidates to self-manage their own appointments. All right, it looks like we do have a few more questions coming in. Very good question. The question is, can we skip this step of documenting if they arrived, as if they have a score they would have shown for the assessment? Absolutely. Marking whether a candidate arrived or was a no-show is definitely not a requirement within the system. It's often just used in the case where you have a proctor for some type of decentralized recruiting center where the recruiter would not be actually administering the assessments themselves. Very good question. All right, any other questions? All right. Well, this concludes today's webinar then. We have reviewed the Scheduling Center permissions and related security. We've created calendars and assigned permissions. We've detailed the process to add and manage time slots. We've demonstrated how to associate a calendar to your requisition. And we've staged an invitation for candidates to self-schedule and to find options for managing their scheduled appointments. You have all been invited to a second advanced functionality webinar this Thursday, March 29th at 9 a.m., which will cover the Cherry Road Public Sector Assessment module. We hope to see all of you in attendance, and for those of you who had specific questions about how your scores and multi-phase assessments would factor into this process, I strongly encourage you to attend the Cherry Road Public Sector Assessment module training as well. If you think of any questions after this training, please send an email with your questions to recruitonboard@das.ohio.gov listed here. We'll get back to you with a response as soon as possible. Again, we will be sharing these slides in the near future. And in addition to that, we'll be sharing this recorded webinar and information on how to access the webinar video. All right, thank you all for your time. And I'll stay on for the last few minutes to just answer a few questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to keep them coming in. A few questions. If we were to mark them as a no-show, will they be able to go back in to reschedule? In the case that you were to mark the candidate as a no-show, they wouldn't be able to reschedule. So in the case where you have assessments or rather appointments scheduled for a 5-week period, identifying someone as a no-show would prevent them from being able to schedule again. Another question, we would just use the interview CSW, I think, versus the pipeline, since they would only be scheduling once. What's the time frame from self-scheduling in CPSA to scheduling for an interview? Well, I can definitely confirm. If you only intend to have these candidates schedule once, then it seems like the Ohio CSW interview-only candidate selection workflow is the selection workflow you'd want to use. The time frame from self-scheduling in CPSA to the interview scheduling, though, I'm not quite sure what you mean there. Recall that in CPSA, you're not actually allowing candidates to self-schedule. The scheduling in CPSA you would do on behalf of a candidate. So in the case where you're using both tools together, you would have candidates self-schedule in the Taleo Scheduling Center module, like we just saw today, and then you would integrate that data over by running a report and importing it into Cherry Road. So that's how those two systems will talk to each other, in a sense, in terms of getting dates, scheduled dates for self-scheduling in the scheduling center into CPSA. Does that answer your question? There's also a question, will the Q&A be made available? Absolutely. When we're sending out our information with our slides, we can definitely share this Q&A as an additional resource. And another question, if we reschedule candidates for an accommodation on a different day, do we have to create a new calendar in order to be able to enter their score? To create you definitely would not have to create a new calendar. I'm thinking, though, if you're referring to scheduling based on an accommodation, it might be best to just track that scheduled time, since you would be doing it manually, essentially, with that one-on-one with the candidate, that you would just track it within CPSA as just like a one-time schedule, one-off. And in general, with one-offs in that scenario, I'd recommend just using CPSA, because that's where you can leverage the functionality like the test retake period and the test score expiration. Any other questions?